Nobody was looking for anything that afternoon. Ray Dow was just cutting through Elmore Street the way he always did on Thursdays, windows down, radio off, thinking about nothing in particular. He had done that drive 1,000 times. He knew every crack in the pavement, every dog that barked from behind every fence. He was not the kind of man who stopped for things, but he stopped. He didn't decide to stop. The car simply slowed, the way a car slows when the foot lifts off the gas without the driver noticing. And by the time Ray understood what was happening, he was already parked at the curb with the engine still running, staring at the porch of a house he had never paid attention to before.
The sun's going down behind the old oak tree. Grandma's in the kitchen cooking something for me. I can hear the wind talking through the screen door. Sounds like someone calling from a place I don't know. Mama left a song somewhere in my chest. Can't say what it's called, but I know all the rest. The blues don't need a name when it lives in your bones. You just open your mouth and it finds its way home. The blues don't need a name when it lives in your bones. You just open your mouth and it finds its way home.
When the boy finally paused, not finishing, just pausing, the way you pause in the middle of a sentence to find the next word, Ray got out of the car. He walked up the short path to the porch and stood there until the boy looked up. He asked the boy his name. The boy told him, Calvin, Calvin James. Ray asked how long he had been playing. Calvin thought about it the way people think about questions they have never been asked before. Said he didn't know exactly. Said his grandmother had found the guitar under the house when he was 9 and given it to him because nobody else wanted it, and he'd been carrying it around ever since. Ray asked if he had ever played for anyone. Calvin said no. Said he just played when he felt like it, mostly in the mornings before his grandmother woke up and on the porch in the late afternoon when the heat broke. Said he didn't really think of it as playing. Said it was more like thinking out loud. Ray Dowell had worked in music for 21 years. He had heard a lot of people play. He had heard people who were technically perfect and emotionally hollow, and people who were raw and uneven but had something in them that no amount of training could manufacture. He knew the difference between someone who had learned to play blues and someone who had been born already knowing it and was just now finding out. He asked Calvin if he had ever heard of the Blues House. Calvin said he hadn't. Ray said he thought Calvin should come with him on Friday night. Calvin looked at the guitar in his hands for a moment, then back at Ray. He asked why. Ray said because there were people who needed to hear what he had just heard. Calvin was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Ray thought he was going to say no. Then Calvin stood up, tucked the guitar under his arm, and said he'd have to ask his grandmother. The Blues House was on the second floor of a building on Commerce Street that had been 3 different things before it became what it was now. A dry goods store in the 40s, a barbershop in the 60s, a place that sat empty for 11 years with a for lease sign in the window that nobody ever called about. The current owners had put in a small stage at one end and folding chairs that didn't quite line up straight and a sound system that was better than the room deserved. On Friday nights, it filled up. Not with the kind of crowd that came to be seen, but with the kind that came to listen. There was a difference, and the room knew it. Ray had called ahead. He had not said much, just that he was bringing someone, that the judges should keep an open mind, that he would explain later. The woman who answered said they were already full for the night. Ray said he understood. She put him on hold for 2 minutes, and when she came back, she said, "Fine, bring whoever it is, but they go last." Calvin was quiet in the car the whole way there. He had the guitar case Ray had found him, a soft case, nothing expensive, just something to carry it in across his knees and his hands folded on top of it, and he looked out the window at the streets going by without saying anything. Ray didn't push it. He had learned a long time ago that the kind of people who had something real inside them were usually the quietest ones before they played. The ones who talked a lot before they went on stage usually had less to say once they got there. They arrived 40 minutes before Calvin was scheduled to go on. The room was already half full. People standing near the back with drinks, people in the folding chairs leaning toward each other in conversation, the low hum of a crowd that was comfortable and expectant. A woman was finishing her sound check on stage, mid-40s, experienced, a voice that filled the room without effort. People watched her and nodded. This was what they had come for. Calvin stood just inside the door and looked at the room for a long moment. Ray watched him. The boy's face didn't show fear exactly. It showed the particular stillness of someone who is calculating something without knowing the numbers yet. Then he looked down at the case in his hands and something settled in his expression, and he followed Ray to the side of the stage where the other performers were waiting. There were 4 of them ahead of Calvin. A man in his 50s with a 12-string, a woman who played harmonica and sang with her eyes closed the entire time, 2 brothers who did a call and response that the crowd loved, all of them experienced. All of them with the easy confidence of people who had done this before and knew roughly what to expect from a room like this one. They looked at Calvin the way people look at something that doesn't belong. Not cruel about it, just honest. He was 16 years old in a room full of adults, holding a battered guitar in a soft case that didn't close all the way, wearing the same jeans and white t-shirt he had been wearing on the porch. One of the brothers said something quietly to the other, and they both looked away. The woman with the harmonica asked Ray if the boy was his son. Ray said no. She nodded and didn't ask anything else. The judges were at a table to the left of the stage, 3 of them. Marcus Tate, who had been doing this for 15 years and had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. Denise Cole, a music journalist from Memphis who wrote about blues the way other people wrote about history carefully, with the understanding that she was documenting something that mattered. And James Pruitt, the youngest of the 3, 34 years old, who had grown up in Chicago and knew the blues the way you know the neighborhood you were born in, not academically, but in the body. When Calvin's name was called, Marcus looked at the list in front of him and then looked up at the stage and then looked at Ray, who was standing at the side. Ray gave him nothing. Marcus looked back at the stage. Calvin walked out with the guitar and sat down on the stool that had been set up for the previous performer. He didn't adjust the microphone. He didn't look at the audience. He opened the case. It was not his guitar. Where the weathered acoustic should have been, there was a Telecaster battered, road-worn, cracked pickguard, a cord coiled beside it. He understood in the first second. Someone had been in the case. He did not look up. He did not look toward the side of the stage. He reached in, took it by the neck, turned it once in his hands, pressed his thumb across the strings, felt the weight, the distance between the frets. It was not his guitar, but it was a guitar. He set the case on the floor beside him. He put the guitar in his lap. The room was still talking. James Pruitt leaned toward Denise and said something. She smiled slightly. Marcus was writing something on the paper in front of him. In the back of the room, someone laughed at something that had nothing to do with the stage. The folding chairs shifted and creaked. Nobody had turned to look yet. Calvin put his fingers on the strings. He didn't count in. He didn't adjust his posture. He didn't look up. He just started playing.
Where the river runs red, carried all my sorrow from the words left unsaid. I never had a father, Never had much land, just this old guitar and these two empty hands. But something found me, sitting on that porch. But the blues came and found me, sitting on that porch, burning like a candle, burning like a torch. You can take everything, take the roof, take the floor, but you can't take the music. That's what God put me here for. Grandma raised me quiet, taught me wrong from right, but the blues raised me different in the middle of the night. But the blues came and found me, sitting on that porch, burning like a candle, burning like a torch. Sometimes they come barefoot with no one knowing their
When the last note faded, Calvin sat still with his hand resting on the strings. He was not waiting for anything. He was not listening for a response. He was just finishing the way you finish when you have said everything you had to say, and there is nothing left to add, not as performance, not as punctuation, but as the natural end of something that had its own shape and knew when it was done. The guitar was still warm under his hand. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting for permission to react, but the silence of people who have had something taken out of them and don't yet know what to put back in its place. 7 seconds. Nobody counted them. But everyone felt them pass, one by one, like something being measured carefully before it is released. Then Marcus Tate stood up. He didn't say anything. He simply stood. The way a person stands when standing is not a choice, but a response when the body moves before the decision is made, because something has happened that is larger than decision. His face, which had been professionally composed for 15 years of doing exactly this, was not composed now. It was open in the way of something that has had its structure removed from the inside. Denise Cole stood immediately after, her notebook still open in front of her, the pen she had stopped using still resting across the unfinished sentence she had not gone back to complete. She stood with her hands pressed together in front of her face, fingertips at her lips, nodding slowly, the nod of someone confirming something to themselves rather than communicating to anyone else. James Pruitt stood last, and when he did, he exhaled a long breath held too long, the breath of someone surfacing from somewhere deep. And then the entire room stood, not in sequence, not waiting for permission, but all at once the way things happen when everyone arrives at the same place at the same time. The sound that followed was not the sound of a competition being won. It was something quieter and larger, the sound of 200 people acknowledging something they had just been given, something they hadn't expected to receive that evening. Some of them were crying without having decided to. A woman in the third row had both hands pressed flat against her sternum, the same gesture she had made without realizing it during the song. A man near the back wall who had crossed his arms and uncrossed them and looked at the floor during the performance was now standing with his arms at his sides, looking at the stage with the expression of someone who has just been reminded of something they had forgotten they knew. Calvin looked up for the first time since he had started playing. He looked at the room standing in front of him, and his expression was not triumph, and it was not relief. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something they didn't have words for before. He held the guitar against his chest, the borrowed Telecaster that was not his guitar, and he looked at 200 people standing in folding chairs, and he did not know what to do with what they were giving him. He was 16 years old. He had played on a porch for nobody. He had never played for anyone. And now this. The applause took a long time to settle. When it finally did, Marcus sat back down slowly, the way a man sits when his legs have decided something before his mind caught up. He asked Calvin how old he was. Calvin said 16. Marcus nodded and asked where he was from. Calvin said Clarksdale. Just Clarksdale, no further detail. The way people from a place say it when the place is the whole explanation. Denise asked how long he had been playing. Calvin said since he was 9. Said he found the guitar under the house. Said his grandmother gave it to him. Said he never took a lesson. Said he didn't know there was anything to learn that he hadn't already figured out on his own. James Pruitt leaned forward and asked Calvin who taught him to play like that. Calvin said nobody. Said his mother used to sing around the house when he was small, and he remembered the way the songs felt before he remembered the words. Said when he found the guitar, he just started doing with his hands what he had been hearing in his head for as long as he could remember. James sat back slowly. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the table. Then Marcus looked up and said something he had not planned to say, that in 30 years of listening to blues, he had heard that quality in a person's playing maybe 4 or 5 times, that it wasn't skill. Skill was learnable. What he was talking about arrived in certain people the way weather arrived without explanation, without asking anyone's permission. He said he wasn't going to name names because names would make it sound like a comparison, and it wasn't a comparison. It was a category, a separate thing entirely. Then James said it quietly, almost to himself, but into a microphone in a silent room. He said he hadn't heard phrasing like that since B.B. King. The room reacted before anyone had time to process it, a collective shift, a change in pressure that everyone felt at the same moment. Several people looked at each other. A woman near the front put both hands over her mouth. An older man in the back row leaned forward and stared at the boy on the stage with an expression that was not skepticism anymore. Calvin didn't react. He didn't know the full weight of the name. He knew it the way you know a name you have heard mentioned in passing without anyone ever explaining what it meant. And it was in that moment, while the room was still absorbing what James had said, that Calvin James saw them. They were standing at the back of the room near the door. His grandmother, first small and upright, wearing the good coat she only brought out for things that mattered, her hands folded in front of her. Her face doing something complicated that Calvin had never seen it do before. And beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, a woman Calvin had not seen in 4 years, his mother. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair was different. But her eyes were exactly as he remembered them, and they were full, completely full, in the way of someone who has been trying not to cry for a long time and has just lost the fight entirely. Calvin did not move. He sat on the stool with the borrowed guitar in his lap, and he looked at his mother standing at the back of the room, and something happened in his face that nobody in that room could fully describe afterward. It was not the expression of a boy seeing his mother after 4 years of absence. It was not relief, and it was not anger, and it was not the complicated mixture of both that anyone watching might have expected. It was something quieter and more fundamental, the expression of someone who has just sung about a father who was an absence and a grandmother who was everything else, who has just put everything he carried into a song and sent it out into a room full of strangers, and has looked up to find that the person the song was really for was there all along, standing at the back, listening. His grandmother gave him the smallest nod, the nod that meant what her nods had always meant: I see you, I have always seen you, you did what you needed to do. Calvin held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at his mother, and his mother pressed one hand flat against her mouth and the other flat against her chest, and she did not look away. The room was still watching him. The judges were still at the table, but Calvin was somewhere else for a moment, somewhere that had nothing to do with the stage or the room or the name that James had just said out loud. He was somewhere that belonged only to him and to the woman standing at the back of the room in a jacket he didn't recognize, and he stayed there for exactly as long as he needed to before he came back. Denise Cole asked him if he knew who B.B. King was. Calvin said he knew the name. She asked if he had ever heard his music. Calvin said he didn't think so. Said they didn't have a lot of records in the house. Said his grandmother sang more than she listened. Said the music he knew was mostly the music he had made up himself, because it was the music that was already there when he went looking, already waiting inside him before he had an instrument to put it through. Marcus Tate looked at him for a long time, long enough that Calvin held his gaze without looking away, without shifting, with the particular patience of someone who has nothing to hide and therefore nothing to prove. Then Marcus said that what Calvin had done on that stage tonight was not something that could be taught. He said there were things in music that came from practice and study and years of work, and those things mattered and produced real musicians. And then there was something else, something that didn't come from anywhere anyone could point to, that arrived in certain people the way weather arrived, without explanation, without schedule, without asking anyone's permission, and when it arrived it was unmistakable because it was the only thing in music that couldn't be manufactured or approximated or learned from someone else. He said that in his experience that thing was very rare. He said Calvin had it. He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that doesn't need decoration. James asked Calvin what he was going to do now. Calvin thought about it. He looked down at the guitar in his lap, the borrowed Telecaster. Not his guitar, the guitar that someone had put in his case to unsettle him and that he had played anyway, the way he played everything, which was the only way he knew how. He said he was going to go home. He said his grandmother would be waiting. He said she didn't like it when he was out past 10. Someone in the audience laughed, not unkindly, but the laugh of recognition. The laugh of people who have just watched something enormous and been reminded that the person at the center of it is still 16 years old and still has a grandmother who sets a curfew and still has a life outside of what just happened on that stage. And then the room was applauding again, differently than before, with something warmer in it, something that understood more now than it had understood at the beginning of the night. Calvin stood up from the stool. He put the guitar back in the case and closed it as much as it would close. He picked it up and walked off the stage the same way he had walked on, without ceremony, without performance, without any particular awareness of what he was leaving behind. Ray was waiting for him at the side of the stage and didn't say anything. He just put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, and they walked together toward the back of the room. The crowd parted slowly, people touching Calvin's arm as he passed, saying things he heard without fully absorbing. Faces turned toward him with expressions he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. He moved through all of it with the same stillness he had carried all night. Not because he was unmoved, but because what was moving inside him was too large and too new to be expressed in the way people expected things to be expressed in moments like this one. His grandmother was where he had seen her, near the door, in the space between the last row of folding chairs and the wall. She was not crying. She had never been the kind of woman who cried in public, and she was not going to start now in this room in front of these people. But something in her face had shifted in a way that Calvin had never seen before. Something had been confirmed there that she had known for a very long time and had never had words for. She put both hands on the sides of his face when he reached her, the way she had done when he was small, and she needed him to understand something important, and she looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said only this, that she had heard him, that she had always heard him, that the music had been there since before the guitar and since before any of it. and that what he had just done on that stage was his and had always been his, and nobody had given it to him and nobody could take it away. Calvin held her hands against his face and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, she had stepped back slightly, and he understood why before he turned around. His mother was standing 2 feet behind him. Up close, she looked more like he remembered and less like the altered version his memory had been constructing for 4 years. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a moment so many times that when it finally arrives, the rehearsal is useless, and all that remains is the unrehearsed truth of it. She didn't reach for him immediately. She stood and let him look at her, and she looked back, and the space between them held everything that 4 years of absence had put there, the weight of it, the shape of it, the particular texture of time that has passed without being shared. Calvin looked at her for a long moment. Then he said her name. Just her name. Nothing else. The way you say the name of something you have been carrying for so long that finally saying it out loud changes the weight of it. She crossed the distance between them and put her arms around him, and he let her, standing with the guitar case in one hand and his other arm around her back. And neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. There would be time for words later, for the explanations and the questions and the long, difficult conversations that don't resolve easily and don't end cleanly. All of that would come, but not yet. Not here. Ray Dowell stood slightly apart from all of it, near the door, hands in his pockets, looking at the floor with the expression of someone who understands that the most important thing he can do right now is take up as little space as possible. He had driven down Elmore Street on a Thursday afternoon. He had stopped without deciding to. He had listened to a boy play guitar on a porch and had done the only thing that made sense to do, which was to bring that sound somewhere it could be heard properly. He had not known about the mother. He had not known about 4 years of absence or a grandmother with a good coat she only brought out for things that mattered. He had known only what he heard through a car window on an ordinary afternoon, and he had acted on it, and standing near the door watching Calvin James hold his mother in the back of a blues venue, Ray thought that sometimes that was enough. Sometimes you did one thing correctly and everything else arranged itself around it. They left together, Calvin and his grandmother and his mother and Ray, walking out of the blues house and down the stairs and out onto Commerce Street where the night was cool and quiet. His grandmother and his mother got into the back seat together, sitting close, the way people sit when they have things to say to each other that they haven't said yet but are ready to begin. Calvin got into the front seat with the guitar case across his knees and his hands folded on top of it, the same posture he had held on the way there, except that everything was different now in the way that things are different when the shape of a life has shifted without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it happened. Ray started the engine. Outside, the city moved past the windows the way it always did, the same streets and lights in ordinary Friday night quietness, unchanged, indifferent, going on the way everything goes on regardless of what has just happened to the people moving through it. But inside the car, something was different. Something had been set down and something else had been picked up, and Calvin James, 16 years old, barefoot, holding a guitar case with a broken zipper, was only beginning to understand what either of those things meant. If this story reached you, tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you. And subscribe to keep hearing the stories that don't ask permission but deserve to be told.